The moment his fork hovered halfway to his mouth, he noticed the stillness behind him, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, and when he turned his head just enough to see the small figure frozen in the aisle, eyes wide and fixed on his plate, something old and fragile inside him cracked open in a way he had not felt in years, and in that breathless second the question arrived without mercy: what would you do if a stranger's hunger suddenly mirrored your own past? If one look from a child asked you to remember who you used to be before the world taught you to look away? The diner sat on a quiet street in a fading town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the booths were worn soft by decades of elbows and secrets, and the windows carried fingerprints of countless mornings. Nathan Carter had come there out of habit more than hunger, seeking the comfort of predictability after a week that had hollowed him out. His job at the steel distribution yard had been cut again, hours trimmed with polite words that hid fear, and he carried the familiar weight of uncertainty in his chest as he studied the plate in front of him: eggs too yellow, pancakes stacked too neatly, bacon glistening with the promise of warmth. He had not noticed the woman and the child when they slipped inside, moving carefully as if afraid the air itself might protest their presence. The woman's name, though he did not know it yet, was Rebecca Miller, and the little girl was Hannah, 4 years old, with curls that refused to obey gravity and eyes that had learned too early how to watch quietly. Rebecca had planned it carefully, choosing the far booth near the door, ordering only coffee she barely touched, counting coins inside her jacket pocket while Hannah stood beside her, too tired to ask questions. She had told herself this stop was only for the restroom, only to warm their hands before walking another mile to the shelter that sometimes had room and sometimes did not. She had promised herself she would not let her daughter stare, would not let her see the plates of strangers, the abundance that once belonged to them before her husband's accident and the medical bills that followed and the eviction notice that arrived folded with cruel neatness. But hunger has a gravity of its own, and Hannah's gaze drifted without permission, landing on Nathan's breakfast like a prayer she did not know how to say. Rebecca noticed too late, felt the heat of shame rise in her throat, and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, guiding her toward the door with the practiced grace of someone who had learned how to disappear quietly. Nathan watched the motion from the corner of his eye, the way the woman stiffened, the way the child hesitated, the way the door seemed suddenly too far away. Something in the tilt of Hannah's head took him backward in time, to a different diner in Ohio, to a winter morning when he was 6 and his mother had pretended they were just waiting for someone, not counting the minutes until the manager told them to leave, not praying someone would notice the boy with the shaking hands and the empty stomach. He remembered the color of the vinyl seats, the smell of syrup, the humiliation that settled like dust in his bones and never quite left. And now here it was again, standing 3 feet away in pink knit sleeves, staring at food that might as well have been behind glass. If this were you, he wondered, if your past suddenly stood in front of you wearing someone else's childhood, would you stay silent to protect your pride, or would you risk the awkwardness, the misinterpretation, the fragile dignity of a stranger, just to answer a hunger that words could not reach? He felt the fork lower back to the plate without tasting anything, felt his chest tighten with a tenderness that surprised him. He told himself he had little enough already, that his own future was uncertain, that kindness could not fix the broken systems that had led them all here. But another voice, quieter and older, reminded him that no one had saved him back then, and that memory alone carried its own kind of debt. Rebecca reached for the door handle, heart pounding, already bracing for the cold outside, already planning how to distract Hannah from the smell that clung to their clothes, when she sensed movement behind them. Nathan rose from the booth with the awkward urgency of a man unpracticed in generosity, carrying his plate with both hands as if it were something sacred. He did not speak, because he feared his voice might betray him, but he knelt beside the little girl and set the plate gently on the edge of the empty table near the door, nodding once toward it, eyes kind but careful, offering without demanding thanks. Rebecca froze, every instinct screaming caution, but Hannah had already taken a step forward, drawn by instinct stronger than fear. The girl looked up once, seeking permission without words, and when Rebecca finally nodded, tears burning uninvited, the child reached for a piece of bacon with reverence usually reserved for church. In that moment, time loosened its grip, and the diner seemed to breathe differently. Nathan stood and returned to his booth, staring at his empty place with a strange fullness in his chest. Rebecca sank onto the edge of the seat, watching her daughter eat with small, careful bites, the tension in her shoulders melting into something that felt dangerously like relief. No one else noticed, or if they did, they looked away with the practiced politeness of a world that survives by minding its own business. Outside, traffic passed, indifferent and steady, carrying stories that would never intersect again. But inside that narrow space, something delicate and irreversible had shifted. They did not speak, and perhaps that was why the moment lingered so powerfully, unanchored by explanation or obligation. Rebecca wiped Hannah's hands with a napkin she found in her purse, murmured silent thanks toward the man who pretended to study the window, and stood when the plate was empty. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and placed 2 quarters beside the cup she had not finished, a gesture small and stubborn, an offering of dignity she refused to surrender. Nathan noticed, and the sight of those coins struck him harder than any plea could have, reminding him that pride often survives even when comfort does not. When the door closed behind them, the bell chimed softly, and the sound followed him long after they disappeared down the street. Nathan paid his bill and left a tip he could barely afford, stepping into the pale afternoon with the unsettling feeling that something important had just happened, something that did not fit neatly into gratitude or regret. He walked to his truck slower than usual, thinking of his mother, of the kindness she never received, of the ways people pass each other like ghosts, unaware of the quiet wars being fought behind ordinary faces. He did not know where Rebecca and Hannah would sleep that night, did not know if the shelter would have space, did not know if the world would be gentler tomorrow. But he knew that for a few minutes, hunger had been answered not with charity, but with recognition, and that knowledge warmed him more than any breakfast could have. Rebecca and Hannah walked toward the bus stop, hands linked, the city unfolding around them with its usual indifference, but something inside Rebecca felt lighter, not because their problems had vanished, but because a stranger had seen them and chosen not to look away. Hannah skipped once, energy returning in a fragile burst, and Rebecca allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that the road ahead might hold more kindness than cruelty. She did not know Nathan's name, and he would never know hers, but the memory of that silent exchange would become a quiet lantern she carried through darker nights, a reminder that dignity could survive even in borrowed spaces. And somewhere between those 2 separate lives, between a man haunted by his past and a woman fighting for her child's future, a small act of compassion rewrote something invisible but essential, proving that second chances sometimes arrive disguised as breakfast on a chipped white plate. Before this story ends, pause for a moment and ask yourself what you might have done in that diner, and share in the comments the choice your heart would make. If this story touched something tender inside you, if it reminded you of kindness you once received or hope you still carry, please gently like, comment, share, and subscribe, so more hearts can find stories like this when they need them most.